In this episode, we're going to turn privacy policies from intimidating documents into something you can picture people actually using on a busy Tuesday, because a policy that cannot be used is basically a decoration. The Certified Information Privacy Manager, CIPM, exam expects you to understand that privacy policies are one of the main tools a program uses to translate obligations and strategy into consistent behavior. Beginners often think a privacy policy is just a public statement on a website, but inside an organization, privacy policies are the rules that guide how personal information is handled from collection to disposal. When those rules are unclear, teams improvise, and improvisation creates inconsistency, missed obligations, and loss of trust. We'll build a plain language understanding of what makes a policy usable, how policies connect to governance and operations, and how they should cover the full data lifecycle without turning into an unreadable wall of text. By the end, you should be able to explain what a good privacy policy does, why it matters, and how a program manager designs policies that get followed. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyber.author.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. A usable privacy policy starts with a simple truth that people forget when they are writing documents. Policies are meant to change behavior, not to prove that someone understands theory. A policy is a set of rules that describes what must be true, and it should be written so the right people can recognize when it applies and what it requires. If the only people who can interpret a policy are lawyers and privacy specialists, then the policy is not controlling the organization. It is only controlling a small group of readers. Usability matters because privacy work is distributed, meaning product teams, support teams, marketing teams, and vendor managers all handle personal information in different ways. When policies are usable, they reduce friction because teams can make decisions without guessing or waiting for emergency approvals. When policies are unusable, teams either ignore them or reinterpret them, and both paths lead to inconsistency. A privacy program manager should think of policies as guardrails that keep the organization on the road even when the driver is tired, busy, or new. That is why the exam treats policies as program infrastructure rather than paperwork. The first characteristic of a usable policy is clarity of scope, because a policy that does not define its boundary creates confusion and conflict. Scope answers what kinds of data and what kinds of activities the policy covers, such as whether it applies to personally identifiable information, PII, or to broader categories like any data related to an identifiable person. Scope also answers who must follow the policy, such as employees, contractors, and partners acting on the organization's behalf. A policy that says it applies to all data at all times can sound strong, but it often becomes meaningless because no one knows what actions it actually requires. A better approach is to define the kinds of processing activities covered, such as collection, use, sharing, retention, and disposal, because those life cycle stages are where decisions occur. Scope should also account for different populations, such as customers and employees, because the same organization often processes both and obligations can differ. When scope is clear, teams can tell when a policy applies, which is the first step toward compliance. Policies must also connect to the privacy life cycle, because privacy risk and obligations appear at every stage, not only at collection or at breach response. A life cycle approach means policies address what happens when data is collected, what rules apply to how it is used, how sharing is controlled, how long it is retained, and how it is disposed of. If your policies only talk about confidentiality and security safeguards, you may miss purpose limitation, transparency, and rights handling obligations that shape trust. If your policies only talk about notices and consent, you may miss internal controls like access discipline, retention rules, and monitoring that make those promises real. A privacy program manager designs policies so they cover the end-to-end story, because people process data end-to-end, and gaps are where mistakes happen. This is also why policies must align with procedures, because policies set the rule and procedures make the rule executable. But the policy still needs to indicate that the procedure exists and must be followed. When an exam scenario describes inconsistent handling across stages, the answer often involves strengthening policies so they cover the full life cycle and create consistent expectations. One of the most important usability traits is plain language that does not hide obligations inside dense phrasing, because policies are not helpful if they require rereading and interpretation every time. Plain language does not mean childish language, and it does not mean removing precision. It means using words and sentence structure that a serious beginner can follow without losing the thread. A policy should avoid vague verbs like consider or strive when the intent is a requirement, because vague words invite inconsistent interpretation. It should also avoid mixing multiple rules into one long sentence, because people miss conditions and exceptions when they are buried. Another plain language strategy is to use consistent terms throughout the policy, such as always using one term for personal data and one term for processing, because switching terms makes readers wonder whether the meaning changed. A privacy program manager should treat language as a control, because language determines whether the organization behaves consistently. When policies are readable, teams can use them as decision tools rather than as background documents. That is what makes a policy operationally real. Another key characteristic is that a usable policy states responsibilities and decision rights clearly, because policies are often ignored when no one feels ownership. A policy should make it clear who must do what, and who has the authority to approve high-risk actions or exceptions. For example, if a policy requires review before certain sharing occurs, the policy should specify that privacy review is required and that the review outcome is binding, rather than leaving it as informal advice. If a policy requires retention limits, it should specify who owns retention schedules and who is accountable for ensuring deletion occurs as expected. If a policy requires training, it should identify who is required to complete it and how completion is enforced. The goal is not to turn the policy into an organizational chart, but to remove ambiguity about where responsibility sits. Ambiguity causes gaps, and gaps cause noncompliance and trust failures. When a policy includes clear ownership, it becomes easier to measure adherence and easier to improve processes when adherence is weak. The exam often prefers answers that clarify roles and accountability because those choices make policies enforceable. It also helps to understand the difference between internal privacy policies and external privacy notices, because confusing these leads to unusable documents. An external notice is meant to inform people whose data is processed, explaining what is collected, why, how it is used, and what rights and choices exist. An internal policy is meant to guide employees and partners, describing rules and required behaviors to ensure the organization's processing aligns with obligations and commitments. A mature privacy program ensures that internal policies support the external notice, because if the notice promises one thing and internal behavior does another, trust collapses. This is why policy design must consider the organization's commitments, not just legal minimums, because commitments can create obligations even when the law is flexible. A beginner mistake is assuming external wording can remain broad while internal policies remain vague. But broad promises require disciplined internal control to avoid accidental contradiction. When policies and notices are aligned, teams can confidently explain why rules exist and how they support trust. That alignment also reduces complaints, because people experience consistency between what they are told and what actually happens. The policy becomes the internal engine that makes transparency credible. A usable policy must also handle purpose and minimization in a way that supports real decision-making, because these concepts are central to privacy, but often written as abstract principles. Purpose rules should require teams to define why data is collected and used, and to avoid using data for new purposes without review and documentation. Minimization rules should require collecting and using only what is reasonably needed for the defined purpose, and they should discourage collecting data simply because it might be useful later. These rules are easier to follow when the policy includes clear triggers for when review is needed, such as when a new data category is added, when a new analytics activity begins, or when data will be shared with a new partner. Without triggers, teams do not know when the policy requires action, so they either over-request review or skip it entirely. A privacy program manager should think of purpose and minimization rules as the early-stage controls that prevent larger downstream problems, because once data is collected and integrated into systems, it becomes harder to unwind. When exam scenarios describe data reuse creeping over time, strengthening purpose and minimization policy requirements is often the right program fix. Retention and disposal are another area where usable policies separate mature programs from aspirational ones, because retention is where organizations often drift into keeping everything indefinitely. A retention policy should require that data be kept only as long as needed for defined purposes and obligations, and that deletion or disposal occur reliably when data is no longer needed. Usability here depends on making retention actionable, meaning the policy should require retention schedules, ownership of those schedules, and periodic review to ensure schedules remain aligned with changing processing. It should also require that systems and vendors support retention rules, because a retention policy that ignores third-party processing creates blind spots. Another key is that disposal should be defined as a controlled outcome, not as a casual action, because data that is supposedly deleted but still accessible undermines both compliance and trust. A privacy program manager should understand that retention rules affect rights handling, because deletion requests and access requests are harder when data is scattered and retention is uncontrolled. When policies make retention a shared responsibility across data owners and system owners, the organization can actually execute the rule rather than merely stating it. The exam often tests retention as a life cycle control because it connects directly to risk exposure and operational feasibility. Sharing and third-party processing policies are essential because many privacy failures occur when data moves outside the organization or is accessed by partners without adequate control. A usable policy should define when sharing is allowed, what approvals are required, what contractual expectations must exist, and what oversight continues after onboarding. It should also clarify the organization's expectations for vendors acting as processors, including data use limitations, confidentiality requirements, incident communication duties, and support for rights requests. The policy should also require documentation of sharing decisions, because undocumented sharing becomes invisible and unmanageable. A beginner misconception is that vendor oversight is a one-time checkbox, but programs need ongoing monitoring because vendors can change subprocessors, processing locations, or internal practices over time. A usable policy, therefore, includes triggers for reassessment and requires that material changes be reported and reviewed. Sharing policies should also align with territorial scope thinking, because cross-border processing can add obligations and require stronger safeguards in contracts. When an exam scenario describes a vendor surprise or inconsistent partner practices, the program response often includes strengthening sharing policies and integrating them into procurement workflows so policy requirements are followed consistently. Rights request handling policies are another area where usability is tested because rights are real operational work and people notice quickly when organizations fail to respond. A policy should require that the organization has a consistent intake and tracking process for requests, that identity is verified appropriately, and that responses are provided within required timelines where applicable. It should also define responsibilities for data owners who must locate and provide data from their systems, because rights handling usually spans many systems and teams. The policy should clarify when requests can be partially fulfilled or denied and who approves those decisions, because inconsistent decisions create complaint risk and enforcement attention. Usability here also depends on connecting the policy to procedures that frontline teams can follow, because a policy alone cannot tell someone how to find data across systems or how to coordinate with vendors. A program manager should also recognize that rights handling is measurable, so a policy should support measurement and reporting on request volume, timeliness, and recurring challenges. When exam questions describe chaos in requests, the fix is often not more staff effort, but clearer policy requirements, ownership, and tracking expectations. A usable policy makes rights handling predictable and fair. Security-related policy elements matter too, but in privacy programs the point is not to turn the privacy policy into a security manual, because security is one component of privacy outcomes. A privacy policy should require appropriate safeguards for personal information, including access discipline, least privilege principles, and monitoring appropriate to risk, because unauthorized access and disclosure undermine trust and create legal consequences. It should also require coordination with incident response processes, because incidents often trigger privacy evaluation, communication, and sometimes notification obligations. A policy should define escalation expectations, meaning when employees must report suspected incidents or privacy concerns, because early reporting reduces harm and improves response quality. Usability here depends on clarity about who to contact and what kind of events must be escalated, because vague escalation language leads to underreporting. A privacy program manager should also ensure that privacy policy requirements align with the organization's security policies, because conflicting rules create confusion and encourage workarounds. When the privacy and security functions coordinate policy expectations, the organization can execute safeguards consistently across systems and teams. The exam often treats this coordination as a sign of maturity, because privacy outcomes rely on both appropriate use and appropriate protection. Another usability challenge is exceptions, because no policy survives real life without situations where a team wants to deviate, and unmanaged exceptions are where risk accumulates quietly. A usable policy should define what an exception is, how an exception is requested, who can approve it, what documentation is required, and how exceptions are tracked and reviewed over time. It should also require that exceptions be time-bound or periodically reevaluated, because permanent exceptions often become invisible policy bypasses. Exceptions should be tied to risk evaluation, because high-impact exceptions require stronger approvals and stronger mitigations than low-impact deviations. This is where the organization's risk appetite becomes operational, because appetite determines what kinds of residual risk are acceptable and under what conditions. A beginner mistake is assuming exceptions are a sign of failure, but in mature programs, exceptions are a managed mechanism that allows the business to operate while preserving oversight and documentation. When exceptions are handled through policy, the organization avoids informal workarounds that undermine trust. The exam often prefers structured exception handling, because it is a practical control that preserves program integrity under pressure. Policies also have to be maintainable, because a policy that cannot be updated becomes outdated, and outdated policies become dangerous because teams follow old rules that no longer match obligations or commitments. Maintainability includes ownership of policy updates, review cadence, and a controlled process for communicating changes to stakeholders. It also includes version control and clear effective dates, because teams need to know what applies now and what has been replaced. A privacy program manager should treat policy maintenance as a life cycle in itself, because new products, new vendors, new laws, and new technology uses like artificial intelligence, AI, can create new processing realities that policy must address. If policy maintenance is slow or unclear, teams will create informal rules, and informal rules vary across the organization, which creates inconsistency. Maintainability also supports audits and oversight because the organization can show how it adapted over time, which often matters in enforcement contexts. Policies should therefore be built with a realistic process for updates and communication, not as one-time documents. When you see exam scenarios about drifting practices and outdated commitments, the right answer often involves strengthening policy governance and review mechanisms so the organization stays aligned with reality. To make policies usable, a privacy program manager also has to think about how policies are adopted and taught, because adoption is the difference between a policy that exists and a policy that controls. Adoption requires training that connects policy rules to daily decisions, role-based guidance for teams with high-impact processing responsibilities, and accessible ways for employees to ask questions without fear. It also requires that policies be integrated into workflows, such as product intake processes, vendor onboarding, marketing campaign review, and rights request handling, because integration makes compliance the default. If a policy requires review but the workflow does not include a review step, the policy will be bypassed, not because people are evil, but because the system makes bypassing easy. A mature program uses measurement to see whether adoption is happening, such as whether reviews occur when triggers are present and whether exceptions are documented. It also uses feedback from teams to improve policy wording and related procedures, because usability improves when policies reflect real work constraints. The exam often rewards this operational adoption mindset because program management is about making rules executable, not merely published. When policies are adopted through training and workflow integration, they create durable consistency. As we close, the main point is that usable privacy policies are program controls that guide data processing across the full life cycle, and they work only when they are clear, scoped, enforceable, and connected to real workflows. Policies become usable when they define boundaries and triggers, use plain language that reduces misinterpretation, and assign responsibilities and decision rights so accountability is real. They must cover collection, use, sharing, retention, disposal, rights handling, and incident coordination because privacy risk appears at every stage and gaps create inconsistent behavior. Policies must align with external commitments, vendor oversight requirements, and territorial scope realities so the organization's words and actions stay consistent across regions and partners. They must also include structured exception handling and maintenance processes so the program can adapt without losing control. Finally, policies must be adopted through training, workflow integration, and measurement so they influence behavior rather than existing as shelf documents. When you can explain how to design policies that people can actually follow while still meeting obligations, you are thinking like a privacy program manager, which is exactly what the CIPM exam is designed to assess.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit BareMetalCyber.com.